All right. Well, hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming, making the time to come to our Philosophy Cafe event. We try to do these at least a few times a semester, a couple times a semester, just as part of like a public philosophy engagement kind of outreach kind of thing. We do some other events too. In the summer, we have Ask a Philosopher at the Farmers Market. So we're there usually the first Saturday of every month. And that's really fun, even though it requires that I wake up really early and sometimes David wakes up really early, but we're willing to do it because it's important and fun to do. And the farmers and the vendors seem to like it. They keep asking us to come back, so we're going to keep coming back. And we also do a version of Ask a Philosopher on campus. And that one is more kind of geared to public outreach, but more to the students and faculty and just people on campus as opposed to just people in the community. So the Ask a Philosopher events are different than this one, right? Ask a Philosopher events are very open. It's just like you have any kind of question about any kind of topic, come talk to me about it and I'll try to give you some kind of answer or something like that, right? The philosophy cafes we usually have are more focused. So those are usually, a person giving a talk in their kind of area of expertise and, usually a short 15, 20, 30-minute talk. And then the rest of the time is really open for just people to ask questions, have an open general discussion, that kind of thing. So we do have one other one coming up after this one. So that is, I believe, and Clark, you can double check me. This is April 18th. Is that right? Or 17th, 18th, roughly in 2 weeks. And Clark will be talking about the liar paradox. So that's going to be fun for everyone, I assume, or no one and no one. I don't know. Liar paradox. The liar paradox. That's right. Yeah, I mean, it could also be the lawyer paradox. You can see there's a connection there, but yeah. And then we would have brought in Alan because he has the right kind of background for that. But so for the liar paradox, Clark is going to do that in a couple weeks. What I'm going to talk about tonight is the idea of transformative experience, as discussed by the philosopher Lori Paul, L.A. Paul. And there's some other developing interesting work in this last few years. And of course, vampires are on the docket. They're in the promotional material. So we're going to talk a little bit about vampires, but mostly as an example of a kind of transformative experience. If you want to talk more about vampires, I'll be happy to talk to you about vampires. I don't know enough about them probably, but I'm sure we can crowdsource enough knowledge about vampires to make it kind of interesting. So when we think about and talk about transformative experience, and I've got handouts available, we can make those available, Lori, for people online or that are watching the recording. When we talk about transformative experience, what we're really thinking about is an experience that basically transforms or changes you in some way. And in particular, the way that Lori Paul developed this in like the 2014 book that she wrote is a transformative experience has at least two components. So one component is what's called like an epistemic transformation. So this experience is such that I actually learn new things from going through the experience that I would not have known and perhaps could not have known had I not undergone it, right? So for example, if you think about like the qualitative experience of being a vampire, having a thirst for blood or whatever it is, having sharp supervision, being able to turn into a disembodied mist and go through keyholes, but somehow maintain your consciousness, all of that is like a very different kind of experience. And I don't know what any of that is like, right? So there's at least a kind of phenomenological, what it's like part of that experience. And some of that is stuff that you will come to know on the basis of it, right? The other part of this is what's called like a personal transformation aspect of the experience. And that's supposed to be where the experience is such that your preferences and subjective values are changed as a result of going through the experience, right? So it might be the case that, I don't think I've ever had, they have like soups that are kind of made out of like animal blood and they have things like that. I don't think I've ever really liked or been interested in the taste of blood, but it might be the case that once that vampire switch is flipped, it becomes irresistible and delicious and delightful to me, right? And so my preferences and perhaps some of my subjective values are changed by going through the experience, right? So this is an interesting kind of thing, I think, just generally. And I'll talk here in a second about some dimensions that we might carve up in the context of transformative experience. But when Paul was writing this in 2014, she gives two examples in that book. One of them is vampires. And so when we just think about it in general, part of the issue of transformative experience that she thinks is an interesting puzzle is it's hard to rationally decide whether I should pursue a transformative experience. And the reason that she thinks this is because it transforms me and changes me in some way. What I have to do is I actually have to project stuff that is currently inaccessible from a first person perspective, right? So if I want to know, should I say become a vampire? Part of what I'm doing when I project my future and I decide, do I want to undergo that kind of experience, is if I'm deciding, do I want to do it? I'm basically saying, does Rob, with Rob's attendant preferences and values, if I carry that forward, will that person, will that individual with those values decide, yes, this was a good thing to do, right? Because this is how we often make decisions. I project myself out in the future. I say, do I want to go to this place for lunch? And I say, okay, well, what do I like about it? What do I not like about it? Is it too crowded? Does that have good service? Whatever. And I think about how much I value those things and what is important to me. And then when I project, in 2 weeks, I want to do it. It's because I've carried through that idea of like my preferences and values that I'm kind of imagining myself in that state, right? Or in that situation or in that space. And so part of the idea when I project and plan for my future to do it rationally is I think I have to keep fixed as much as I can about my own preferences and values, because otherwise I'm planning for someone else or I'm planning for something that wouldn't be good for me, right? So if I don't prefer to, we went camping like a lot as a kid. I wasn't a huge fan of it. Maybe you are, and if you are, that's great. But for me, I just thought, man, sleeping on a terrible little air mattress, it's cold, rain's going to leak in through the tent because I don't know how to put it up very well. I know that I don't like that kind of thing. And so I think when I'm planning a trip, I wouldn't want to include a bunch of camping for a Rob trip. So it's like, I don't like that. Why would I plan that for myself, right? So part of what I'm doing when I plan ahead and when I think ahead is I'm keeping fixed my subjective preferences and values, and I'm kind of extending them to that future situation. And I'm imagining, right? I'm using my imagination of what it's going to be like for me to be in that situation. The camping is a really simple thing, or where I want to go to have lunch, maybe it's a really simple thing. But of course, we also try to make big plans for huge, huge things in our life and changes in our life, right? So many people at some point have to decide if they maybe want to have children, right? Or you might have to decide, do I want to move to a place that is wholly different than anywhere I've ever experienced? There's all kinds of decisions that you make that could be transformed, right? And so what Paul argues in this book, this 2014 book, is that if your planning involves a transformative experience, you actually cannot rationally decide to do it or not because you just don't have enough information, right? So again, if I'm thinking about the examples that she gives that she tries to sort of work on this are vampires and then having a child. And so we'll come back to the second one in a second. The first one's more fun. Or maybe it isn't. I don't know. I don't have children, so maybe I'm wrong about that. When I think about being a vampire, I don't know, part of me thinks that would be great and cool and interesting. I'd be immortal, I'd be impervious to stuff. I wouldn't be around sunlight. I don't know. No big deal. I'm not that attracted to the sun anyway. I would stay up at night. I already kind of do that, right? I would dress more fashionably, maybe. I don't know. Like there's a number of things that might be the case. I turn into a vampire. I could fly. Maybe I'm an ethical vampire and I drink animal blood, so I don't have to worry about that objective value stuff that I might be worried about. So when I'm deciding, suppose I even ask friends of mine. Suppose I have a bunch of friends who decided to make that vampire transition. They say, hey, it's great. It's so much fun. I love it. I would never go back, et cetera, et cetera. I can't really substitute their value for mine, right? It's also the case that in a certain way, that transformation of becoming a vampire, in this case, has changed my friends' values. So their values now are not the same as if I'd asked them previously before they made a decision, do you think you should do this, right? So when I'm trying to make a decision, what Paul is suggesting is when we get to these big, life-changing kind of transformative experiences, we actually can't really rationally approach it, at least if we're thinking about it in the context of, what are my preferences? Am I going to carry those forward? And then, yes, Rob would like to, be a vampire or not, because the very act, right, of becoming a vampire is going to teach me some new stuff. I'm going to get that epistemic transformation, and it's going to change maybe what I think and how I value certain kinds of things. So even if I, for example, think, man, I do have this thing about blood, being vampire is going to be rough. It might be the case that once I become a vampire, my attitude about that changes and my subjective preference about that changes, right? So this is an interesting topic and would be interesting even if you just wanted to talk about vampires, but obviously Lori Paul and other philosophers want to do stuff that is related to real life, right? And so one thing that we might do, and that she does at length in this book, is talk about how she thinks having a child is an analogous case. So before she and her partner decided to have a child, it was the case that they just weren't really sure, and they had some ambivalence, and she was trying to project, what does current Lori Paul think my life would be like, and how much would I like it and stuff. And her experience, and she thinks this is really common if you look at like testimony of people who have had children, whether it's, a woman that's carrying the child, or even the man who's like, right, has given his genetic material and is involved in seeing the child when it's first born and raising and all this other stuff, right? That this is kind of an extended transformative experience. And the idea there would be, if I'm just trying to project, this is supposed to be the interesting puzzle. If I'm trying to project, do I want to have kids or not? I mean, on her view, because the experience itself is maybe necessarily or generally transformative, I can't really make that decision rationally, because I just don't have access to what my values are going to be and what it's really going to be like for me and how much I'm going to like it or dislike it. I can make guesses, right? And when we think about things that don't change us, like when we think about experiences that are not transforming this way, we can do it all the time. And there might be other ways that we could rationally decide to have a child or not if it doesn't have anything to do with my subjective values and preferences. So for example, suppose that I think I don't want to have a child because I think overpopulation is a serious problem that I don't want to contribute to it. That doesn't really have anything to do with what my current values are like or how they would stay if I had a child. It's really it's kind of an external reason, right? Whereas something like, I would really find it valuable to raise a human being and help mold them into a person. That's really something where I'm thinking about what my subjective preference would be like in that experience. Or maybe, again, I might rationally decide to have a child because what I really need is an heir. It's really important for whatever reason we've already talked about, for me to have an heir or for my family to have an heir. And that would be a reason to have a child in a way that is totally separate from what I think it will be like and whether I will like it to have a child, right? So she doesn't think that you can't rationally make decisions related to transformative experiences in other ways or based on other factors. But if the real question comes down to, would it be something that I would value and enjoy, that's something she thinks you can't project forward. And so how she thinks you should kind of approach this and why it's a puzzle, notice that you can't, on her view, you can't rationally decide that you should do it or not based on whether you think you would like it or not, right? So it's not that you would be irrational to decide to have a child. It's also that you'd be irrational to not decide to have a child, because in both cases, your values will be changed by the experience to such an extent that you're not currently a good predictor of what your future self is going to like or dislike about that experience, right? So one way to think about this and kind of extend it as a puzzle, she thinks that part of what you have to really acknowledge in something like that is you kind of have to decide, again, based on your subjective experience. There could be other reasons, but if you're just thinking, do I like it, or would I find it enjoyable, or would I find it valuable for me to experience, undergo, she thinks that you kind of have to substitute just making a decision. Am I going to be open to a kind of revelation, to a kind of new experience that is going to change stuff, and I don't know if it's going to be good or bad? And if you're open in that way, maybe you're like, all right, I'm in, let's have a kid or whatever. Maybe if you're not open in that way, you're like, I don't want to have a new experience. I don't want to transform myself. I don't want to receive this revelation. So whatever, right? But in terms of predicting the specific thing that I would really like it or that I really wouldn't, she thinks you can't really do that in a way because you can't preserve those preferences across that transformed experience. So there are a lot of other interesting aspects to this. So there are a couple of British philosophers, Ian James Kidd, which he has to be related to a pilot with that kind of name, right? Ian James Kidd, there's no way he's not related to a pilot. He and his co-author, Javi Carroll, wrote a paper about 4 years ago that kind of expands this concept and really focuses, a lot of Paul's discussion of transformative experience really focuses on like your agency and choice and projecting what you would want. But there's lots of transformative experiences that are not voluntary, right? So I was just reading a paper that came out last year by Jelena Markovich, who's a Canadian philosopher, and she was talking about grief as a transformative experience. And that's obviously not something you choose to have happen to you. It's just a thing that happens that then you undergo a kind of significant transformation from it or something. So Carroll and Kidd's work, and then kind of the extension of Markovich's work, is to recognize and look at transformative experiences that are not largely the result of your choice and you're directing your life in a certain way, but things that might, for example, happen to you or things that are outside of your control. And it's also the case, she talks about this. I mean, her own experience with, having a child was like a very positive one. So you could have a very positive transformational experience, but you could also have a pretty negative one, right? You might undergo something that changes your preferences and values for the worse. And it's like not very good or whatever. It's negatively valenced, right? So if you want to think about dimensions of transformative experience, you can think about voluntary or involuntary or non-voluntary ones. So, Carol and Kidd give this example of Primo Levi, saying that right? He was a chemist, he was a Jewish chemist, and he was in a concentration camp during the Holocaust and was put there obviously against his will. And he obviously, that was a pretty significant transformative experience for him, right? He learned a lot of stuff like what it's like to starve and what it's like to see these people be abused, what it's like to be abused. But he also, in some of his writings, seems to have thought that his life was richer for it. So that could be an experience that's partially negative, but also ultimately taught him something, or he has a positive sort of response to it or whatever, even though it's like not voluntary. So you might think of that as non-voluntary and involuntary. You might make a decision, but it's not like you don't intend the result, right? So for example, if you're walking outside and you see, a car coming and there's a little kid running out, you might intentionally decide, I'm going to save that kid from that car. And you rush in and push the car out of the way, the car hits you, and then maybe you lose use of your legs or something, you're paralyzed. Obviously, you didn't intend that consequence. And that even though the decision was sort of started with you, it might be the case that experience changes your life in a pretty significant way, right? And even changes what you value and what you find interesting and preferred, etc. So you could classify this a number of different ways. And I think you can think of lots of examples. There's, the work I'm most familiar with in this area is in the area of philosophy, but there are psychologists and religious studies scholars and education scholars and all kinds of other people that talk about transformative experience. So there's a really good, kind of review of some of the literature across disciplines by a number of psychologists that came out like a year ago, I think. And so they're comparing how these concepts operate in education and psychology and philosophy and sociology and these other kind of disciplines. And it's of course very different. But of the things that we might classify as transformative experiences, you might think of course, right? We talked about becoming a vampire, not very likely for any of us right now, or maybe it isn't, maybe I'm wrong. Or having a child. But you can also think of the grief of losing a loved one. You can think of a religious experience. People talk about religious experience having a big transformation on them. You could think of, certain kinds of psychedelic experiences. People talk about that as having a really significant transformative effect on them. You might think the decision to pursue an entirely new career could be transformative. It might be transformative to suddenly have all of your livelihood taken away from you and then you get moved somewhere, right? That would be, could be a pretty significant and transformative kind of experience. So there's a number of ways that this kind of thing could occur and could happen. And I think I guess the reason that I'm interested in it and the reason that I wanted to give this talk, other than just it's stuff I've been reading about, is I'm really interested in issues related to the self and issues related to different iterations or variations of yourself. What does it mean to be me, the same object through time? Am I the same object through time? And none of this necessarily requires that your numerical personal identity change, but it might be the case. The Markovich article, for example, suggests that undergoing grief might change your practical identity, might change how you conceive of the world. And after a person you love passes away, one of the first things that you do, it's not like your brain recognizes that. You still think, oh, I'm going to go show them this thing I found, right? Or, oh, they're going to love this joke. And it takes a while for you to kind of catch up, right? And realize that this person is gone and your life is different, right? It might be the case that your practical identity as, a son or brother or daughter or husband or wife or whatever is different because that other person's there, right? And so I think this is an interesting phenomenon because it isn't just, there are these really good science fiction kind of examples or, fantastic examples, but I think that there are lots of cases where we have to make decisions that might radically change not only what our future looks like or where we're going, but how we feel about all of those things and what we not necessarily value in some kind of like moral or political or social sense, but just what do I want for my life and what kind of things do I enjoy? And different kinds of experiences can change that for you. I don't have any children, and I don't want children. I don't think that's irrational, but it might be. Maybe Paul is right, right? But from all of my friends and colleagues that I've talked to, I guess I shouldn't say all, most of the people I've talked to that have had children, they describe something like this occurring, with this transformation of, the chair of the department I went to grad school at said, I didn't ever really know what it's like to love another person to the extent that you would put their welfare ahead of yours every single time until I had a child, right? And then having a child changed that for you, right? And that kind of experience, I think, it's not ubiquitous, but it's like not uncommon either in our lives. And so I think it's an interesting thing to try to reflect on how we might incorporate that into our future planning. I mean, humans are planners. We plan for projects. We have our 5-year plans or 10-year plans or whatever it is, right? And you think even in the short term, what am I going to do next month? What am I going to do this summer? Because I've been teaching for so long, I just think of the world in semesters and just carve it up that way. So I'm like, what am I going to teach next semester? What am I going to do this summer? Do I have time off? Can I work on this project? So it involves a lot of kind of imaginative projecting, right? Of what things are going to be like and how I'm going to focus my attention and sometimes what I'm going to do with myself and my time. And so that's why I thought this topic is interesting and I want to talk with you about it and share it with you. So I've got some suggested discussion questions, but obviously you don't need to ask those questions. Maybe you have other questions or other things you want to talk about or mention. So I guess that concludes me talking part of this, and now we'll all just maybe talk about it. So I don't know. What are you all interested in about this? Do you find it interesting? Do you think it's not very interesting? Do you disagree with Paul and think this stuff doesn't change you that much and it's not that big of a deal? I mean, I don't know. What do you think about this stuff? I would be interested, of course, in any transformative experiences you've had, but you also shouldn't feel compelled to share anything you are not interested in sharing with us either. So
do you think there can be different degrees of transformation?
Sure. Yeah. So for the recording and for Lori, one of our attendees asked, do I think there can be different degrees of transformation? I think so. I think that Paul is really interested in what she describes as like some pretty radical changes. So, and again, I think this is her first personal experience, but I think she probably found having a child, gestating the child, bringing it to fruition, and then like caring for it during its infancy and all this other stuff. I think she found it to be a pretty significant change in her own preferences and values that she would not have necessarily predicted. So I think there can be more and less, I guess, radical kinds of transformation. The big deal would, I guess, the essential part would just be, does it change you in some way, both epistemically, right, and in terms of those personal preferences? I think that there's a lot of, I guess it's my view that there's a lot of experiences that are, I guess I wouldn't say necessarily like transformative in that way, but like you can learn from them, right? So if I have an experience, then maybe I learn what it's like to have that experience, but I just adjust something in a tiny way, right? Maybe it's epistemically transformative, but doesn't actually change my values. Maybe I just go, oh, don't want to eat, at Long John Silver's again, or whatever it is, right? And like, so then but it doesn't really change like my values or my preferences. It's just kind of like a modification. I think for transformative experience, you want something that is epistemically and personally transformative. And that personal part, I think, is probably the most radical part, which is just do some of your preferences and values, subjective values maybe, right? That is values about what you prefer in your experience, or how they become different. But yeah, I mean, I think there are people who have had, I'm really interested in I like to read about people who've had religious experience and how that changes them. And for a lot of people, that's like a 180 shift. It's like a whole different thing. But for other people, it's maybe just a broadening of something that was already there, or a slight reorientation to something or something like that. So I guess I think so. I think you could have degrees of transformation. Sure. What do you think?
Well, I truly believe so, depending upon The event.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, the magnitude of the event probably has a lot to do with the magnitude of the change or transformation, for sure.
So something can transform you almost totally.
Sure.
Where
Yeah.
something can just take a little tweak.
Yeah, alter you a little bit or something, for sure. Yeah.
And one big transformation can lead to a bunch of little ones.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, so in Paul's initial work on this, she talks about these experiences almost as a single experience, but that's not really quite right? Like, I mean, if you think about something like having a child, that's an extended series of events and experiences. So Carol and Kidd, who expand this concept in the 2020 paper, they take, I think, more seriously the idea that you could have experiences that extend for much longer periods of time, like years of your life or something. That so then the change is maybe not instantaneous, it's like a little slower, but yeah, I think so. Yeah, Clark.
Two thoughts.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, great. Yes, sure.
One is, I mean, as given here,
Mm-hmm.
transformative experience is defined so loosely and so vaguely that I worry that there's a point at which this could become just a vacuous hypothesis.
Sure.
It's only a transformative experience if then it's such that you can't
Yeah.
plan for, can't do things rationally because of it.
Sure.
And anything less than that wasn't truly transformative.
Sure.
She even uses, transformative and a personal what? Transformation.
Sure.
So if we don't know what counts as a transformation,
Sure.
how do we know what a transformative experience is? And it seems to be there's at least a question of some sort of clarity
Yeah.
too.
Yeah.
But I go beyond that and say, even the case she brings up,
Mm-hmm.
can't do this actually? Don't people do this?
They do
They
it.
do talk to others who've had children
Sure.
and say, what's that like?
Yeah.
And because we're human beings, there's something analogous there.
Mm-hmm.
Now, this
Yeah.
isn't I was thinking that the vampire thing you didn't go to was like what it's like to be a bat, because often in fictions, vampires can be,
Sure.
Dracula can become a bat.
Of course.
And we have
Yeah.
Nagel sort
Of
question.
course. Yeah.
What it's like to be
Yeah.
a bat. But there was something to be said for creative imagination here.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, if this were the case, and certainly when people plan on having children or, many people, I expect even at this table, have gone through the process of grieving the death of a loved one.
Sure.
Were you not the same person?
So I think that, I guess I want to be careful. I don't think that, so let me, I'm going to repeat your question just for the recording and stuff. Yeah. So we'll come back to the identity stuff. So the question was, the first question that Clark asked is the description of transformative experience too vague and vague enough such that it might apply to every kind of thing? And so then I guess the problem is it's maybe vacuous, but also the problem would be it would result in like a complete paralysis and we would never be able to do anything rationally because everything would potentially transform us or something. So, huh?
Moved to Brooklyn.
Sure.
I grew up on a farm in Kansas. That's really different.
Sure.
That sort of thing.
Sure. Yeah. So then the second question. So what was the second question? Is it that there are putative counterexamples based on analogical reasoning about whether we ought to, say, embark on something like this, like having a child or going to a totally different location or something like that. Yeah. So I think in the first instance, I guess I would just suggest that what you have here is like a small, just simple description that would be longer if you read it in the book, right? And so in the full book, there's more stuff. I guess I would say if the question is what makes something transformative, I mean, the epistemic aspect of it is going to be you learn a new thing that you couldn't have learned without the experience. So let's not worry as much about child rearing, and let's just use a simpler example. Like maybe it's the case that, I mean, this is really simple. I've never had Vegemite, right? What Australian thing or whatever. I would learn new information. It'd be pretty trivial by taking a bite of it, but I would learn something, which is, and people could maybe explain to me what it's like. They can say, well, it's kind of like this. It's kind of salty. It's kind of yeasty. And if I have those experiences, then I'm getting closer to knowing what it would be like, but I still wouldn't really know what it is like from my first person perspective of habit, right? So that transformation epistemically is just the experience itself gives you access to new knowledge or new concepts or new experience that, or sorry, not new experience because you would have to have experience. new knowledge or concepts that you did not have prior to it and that you couldn't have access prior to it. So the what it's like of Vegemite would be one. Again, I assume based on the things that when people have kids, the kind of things they say is that something like a value shift occurs, but also, for example, I guess, what it is like to push a human being out of your body. And I have no idea what that's like because I have never undergone something like that, right? So part of the transformation is supposed to be that epistemic part. The personal part, the way that she specifies this in the book is what is supposed to change there are your subjective preferences and what she calls subjective values. So subjective values in this context are not supposed to necessarily be like your it might include at some point some kind of significant thick moral value, but I think really what she's thinking about, part of what she's thinking about is a kind of classical, rational choice theory, expected utility way to do this, right? Where I might look at my preferences and I really like this thing and I don't like this thing. And so then I make plans on the basis of the expected utility for me or something like that, right? And I think that the point of that personal transformation part is supposed to be undergoing the experience itself. That experience itself causes a change in some of those subjective values or preferences. That is what I like and what I expect to like and what I don't like, right? So I think that I guess I would want to defend Paul in the first instance by saying, I think that there's a ton of experiences we undergo that don't do that. Like I have lots of experiences every day that don't really teach me anything new and that don't change my preferences at all or my values at all. There's going to be some that maybe do, but I don't know that it would necessarily have to expand and kind of threaten this kind of collapse or something.
Yeah.
It might, but so I guess I would say she does a better job talking about it in depth. So if you're interested, you might read further, or you might not. Also, you might not be interested in it. So the second question I think is also really interesting. So the question is, people do reason about this, and they often reason sort of on the basis of analogy, right? So I might ask friends of mine, what was it like when you had your first kid? How long do you have to stay up? And how frustrating was it for you? And all this stuff. And so that's absolutely right, that it's true that I can talk to others who've had like experiences, and that can become a basis for my decision, right? But I think that, again, I guess trying to argue kind of in favor of Paul's thesis, I think that what you would say is, even when you do that, you still are unable to predict how the experience itself is going to affect you. So again, what you're doing is you're projecting forth your preferences and saying, I don't really, maybe it doesn't matter too much to me to be woken up in the middle of the night. Maybe that doesn't bother me. So knowing that that's going to happen a lot, I'm not too worried about it, right? Or maybe I'm not going to, I don't know, I'm okay feeding animals, so probably I'll be okay feeding kids or something like that. Or so you can certainly reason analogically about it. There's no question about that. I think that what she wants to kind of argue for is the claim that if the experience itself changes those preferences, then you actually don't know how those things will change once you have it, right? So I don't know this, again, I've not had a child, but I do know people who wanted a child and then have significant regret about it. What's I think a little more common is people who are scared or frightened or uncertain, and they have a child and they're like, oh, best decision of my life. Great, right? But in either case, there was some legitimate uncertainty about how that experience would affect what their own values were about, how much they preferred to get up in the morning, or how much they valued friends over family, or other kinds of, again, those subjective, I think, preferences and values. So does that get anywhere close to answering some of your concerns?
Somewhat.
Okay.
It might come down to what your criteria of rationality is. I wasn't even thinking of the
Sure.
analogy of yourself with that. Just, okay, you have inductive argument.
Sure.
Range.
Of course.
Let's suppose that 90% of the people, you did just really
Yep.
thorough survey,
Uh-huh.
have had this transformation.
Yep.
that you're contemplating.
Uh-huh.
And after it was done, they had these preferences when they shared, say, the preferences you have now, and they
Yeah.
have different ones. So your preferences are pretty good chance, 90% say,
Sure.
of having the same changes occur that you will end up liking human blood. If you become
Sure,
vegan.
sure,
You
yeah.
will fall in love with your child in such
Sure.
a great way that
Yeah.
it's strange, this sort of thing. And okay, unless I have reason to think I'm radically different than these other people, I've got good reason, rational, to think
Sure.
I will have the same, undergoing the same transformation they underwent,
Yeah.
but I will have the
Will
same
produce
change
similar
in
kinds of
preference.
effects.
That is, my preference changes and be predictable, rational.
Sure.
And if
Yeah.
that's true, then I can go, me at time X+1 after transformation, transformative
Sure.
experience will be able to be predictive of what my values and preference, subjective values and
Sure.
preferences will be then, and I reason rationally what that person would like to have.
Yeah. So what, so for the recording again, Clark's point is that it might be the case that I could get fine-grained enough data about people that have undergone this kind of experience and thus this transformation, and I might even be able to get fine-grained enough data to show that like I am relevantly like them in ways in terms of my preferences. And were I able to get such data, that I could then, it seems like rationally conclude that the likelihood, the probability, right, is that my preferences similar to theirs prior to the transformation would change also similar to theirs after the transformation. And thus, if most of them enjoyed it, then that would be good reason to think I would enjoy it or something like that, right? Yeah. So there's a philosopher who they did like a bunch of special issues on this, like where they had a bunch of people come comment, and there was somebody who gave almost exactly the kind of objection that you gave there. He phrased it in terms of like a variety of local utility functions that you could plot out at different points and stuff. But the basic point was, why couldn't I just do something like that? I think to a certain extent you could, but again, I think that the point there is that there's at least still some opacity in whether or not you would in fact be relevantly like those people, and you would in fact have that positive transformative experience. I think that part of her response to him in the special thing I read on this was that of course could be true, and that actually might be a way for you to authentically make the decision, right? That you have gathered the information, that you've looked at how it affects other people, and you've done everything you can to make sure that you are in a similar position as those people, and thus you're doing, again, what is the most rational thing for you to do. I think that the point there is supposed to be that, or at least one way to think about this is, part of the question that she is concerned with that we haven't really talked about, because I didn't think that it would maybe come up as much, as part of what she's interested in is, in addition to making a rational choice, that you make one that is authentic to you, that is representative of your, whatever those values of yours are, right? And so as long as what you're doing is making this judgment about all of these things and incorporating the probabilities and thinking about it for yourself, that certainly looks more rational than if you had no idea what was going to happen or something. I think that insofar as we are just dealing with some probabilities, and insofar as probably a lot of people don't have anything quite like the fine-grained data that you're talking about, many people in the position are at a more of a level of opacity or more removed from what they're actually going to like and what's it's going to be like when they do it. But in principle, I think we certainly could get closer to making it more rational for projecting ourselves forward. There would still be a little of that kind of wiggle room of like, even if a bunch of people that I trust say it's really good, it might not be good for me. That would be one way we could do it. There was another philosopher, I mean, this is kind of in a different way, part of what you're thinking about, or at least the example you gave was, would it be positive for it? If I surveyed a bunch of people that became a vampire or had children or whatever, and most of them really liked it, wouldn't that give me reason to think it would be, valuable, and I would in fact like it too? One of the authors was describing the fact that her and her husband like don't have any kids and kind of don't want them. They've kind of always been mystified when other people want kids. It's like something they just don't understand from the first person or something. And so she likens this to like, think about the case of, for example, like Winston in 1984, who doesn't want to undergo the indoctrination, but afterwards he's like, man, it was great. I'm so glad I did it. Right. Or if you're a science fiction fan, it's very clear in Star Trek: The Next Generation that Picard does not want to become part of the Borg, right? but with all of that would entail. But then once people are made part of the Borg, they seem pretty jazzed about it, and like they want to help other people become part of the Borg too, right? So I mean, her suggestion, I take it that she's not just comparing child rearing to being like part of the Borg or being indoctrinated via 1984, but you might think that even if it's a thing that I know that I'm likely to like, there might be other reasons that I have to not endorse it and to not do it. And that would be perfectly rational, right? Again, against what Paul is arguing.
You give the very one where somebody might, some philosophy might challenge whether that is a question of personal identity. It's the
Sure.
person who is now.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So so this is good. Thank you for reminding me. I ignored the personal identity part at the end there. Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot of, I don't think that her point is that you become like in some, say, thinking about like numerical personal identity. I don't think you become like a different person in that way, but your qualitative identity changes, and maybe those practical aspects of your identity, like, Christine Korsgaard has written about it, other people.
He's just the same person.
Well, sure, yeah. Well, and I mean, to some extent, it is true, right? Like, I mean, friends of mine who have had children, often their focus in life shifts pretty significantly, and we don't get to, hang out and. Oh, it's the same way, exactly, right? Yeah.
Gain friends, lose friends.
Oh, of course.
Social network.
Yeah.
Is often adjusted radically.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I always think about like, I mean, this is a little bit different, but when my aunt and uncle, so my aunt and uncle on my father's side, well, my uncle on my father's side and his wife had really serious methamphetamine addiction problems for a big chunk of their life. And that, of course, transformed them in other ways, right? But I remember one of the times they got out of jail and they were trying to go straight and be clean and stuff. One of the things they said is basically they don't have any of their old friends because their old friends were all people they just used to get high with, right? And can't do that now. So the people that did take them in and seemed to be at least to some extent friendly with them were people in the church that they went to that were pretty welcoming to them or whatever. So yeah, I mean, maybe so. Yeah, I don't know. It's probably better for them. One of them is way better for them than the other. But so to some extent, yeah. So to some extent, some of that stuff is not gonna change you in that kind of quantitative numerical personal identity way. I mean, I guess in principle, depending on how you understand personal identity, the change could be radical enough that there would be a real discontinuity between the current you and the past you in such a way that it could result in that. So yeah, so maybe like the case of Picard and the Borg is a case like that.
You find ones that are less extreme that could help that story.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, I mean, yeah.
Promoting this.
Yeah.
Sort of thing. Try this.
Yeah.
They call it mind altering.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Things were never the same.
Yes. Yeah. No. I mean, this is, I think, an interesting aspect of like there's been, a lot of recent interest in like therapeutic use of psychedelics in the context of treating other substance use disorder or, treatment resistant depression or anxiety or other kinds of things. Or there's some really interesting empirical work on administering psychedelics while someone is, say, like in the stage of a terminal illness while they're in the process of dying, that this seems to help them process that and accept it in ways that it didn't. So certainly I think there are all sorts of things that can be transformative in a way that isn't quite vacuous, but could really change some important part of you. Whether it would change you numerically is maybe a harder question, but in many cases, yeah, it would result in a significant change. And sometimes people might not recognize you because how they understand you is this web of social relations and attitudes and behaviors and stuff. So
you hit upon what I consider, I raised that as a
oh, sure.
critique, but I think we should recognize.
Okay.
I think you respond effectively to the challenge phase.
Okay.
That's what you do is you marshal all these cases and say, look, is everybody agree? Everybody agree that we need this difference between these things.
Sure.
We can certainly say, oh, flying Vegemite, no, not transformative.
Yeah.
Going through this really significant religious conversion, transformative.
Yeah.
Or taking LSD. For some, maybe
Sure.
not transformative.
For some, it is. Absolutely. Yeah.
Really everybody around them go, wow. And you
Yeah.
see, and not to the extent the board thing where you go, look, that's, so you have to rule out, but you can find
Sure.
an area in there.
Yeah.
Knocks out a lot of really interesting cases
Mhm.
where people would say, no, they're still the same person.
Yes.
But they would say, hey, the world looks a lot different. to
Yeah.
me in some really important ways.
Yes.
The child rearing cases, but some
Yeah.
of these others are really good ones.
Yeah.
I think there's probably people who, when they came out.
Oh, sure.
and you
Absolutely.
think about France, you know,
Absolutely.
you
Yeah.
go through sex change operations. Of what
Sure.
their view,
Yeah.
What that is clearly one of the things I was going, well, and that's one of your things. Are there other experiences that?
That was one that you thought of immediately. Sure. Yeah.
And it could even be as less extreme where somebody is experimental in certain ways.
Hmm.
And they're not sure what that's going to be like.
Absolutely.
And then you get to circumstances where I think we haven't hit enough on, which is the fascinating thing about this are the ones where a person goes, yeah, I learned things about myself I wish I didn't know.
Yeah.
The people who went through those psychiatric experiments where it's like, oh, I found out I
Yeah.
could give people a lethal shot.
Right.
I wish I'd never.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. The Milgram experiments or something. Yeah.
Or even some individuals in the Holocaust, you know, who,
Yeah.
okay, they became gods.
Yeah.
They helped the Nazis,
Right.
but they were in such a state that they're going, now I have to live with that.
Yeah.
For life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. So some of the examples that like the psychological literature goes over do involve directly like trauma and growth after trauma and stuff like that as something that could be really transformative in this way. Yeah. I think that, I mean, one of the things that, Paul responds to the person who I said, gave us the Borg example and stuff by saying, well, certainly there's going to be a range of negative experiences we can know we wouldn't want. Like I've never experienced getting eaten by a shark, but I'm pretty sure I don't want to. It wouldn't be transformative for very long because I'd be done, right? But even if you said, well, maybe it doesn't make it deaf. Let's make a shark just take off, your arm and your leg. That'd be transformative. I still don't think I want to go through it, right? So you can know some things about, even if you don't know exactly what it's like, you can know whatever it's like. I'm pretty sure it's going to be bad, right? And there are probably other cases too where, I mean, the case of, for example, Winston and the Picard and the Borg, what do both of those involve that a lot of these other ones don't involve is like a loss of mental autonomy. And so that might be a consideration that you think that is in addition to how it would affect my subjective experience. That's something that's like, I don't want to ever lose. And so those would be for reasons outside of how you will feel afterwards, things you wouldn't want to undergo or do. So
Yeah, I was thinking that kind of case. Could I rationally want to be a shark?
yeah, to be a shark.
To be a shark.
Yeah, yeah. Go to law school. Yeah. David asked, could I rationally want to be like a shark or a horse or a radically different kind of being? I mean, I think her view would be probably no for the reasons that we've given, which is just that would represent you being so radically different. Go ahead. I'm sorry. Yes. Oh, sure. Yeah. Okay, I see what you're saying. So one way you could say, I don't want to do it is because you would have that loss of autonomy. But I think if what you're just trying to figure out is, would I really like it being a shark? I think our point would be, we don't really know. It's hard to know because that isn't really accessible to you or something, unless you've been a shark.
Been focused on whether you like or prefer it, which is,
Yes.
this is hitting on, I think, an interesting distinction.
Sure,
where you
yeah.
say, like, take somebody like the Matrix sort of choice. where
Okay.
Or you choose something and it's like, oh, I'm really, really happy.
Yeah.
But I've lost something that
Yes.
most of us would value. My future self won't anymore. This is the Winston sort of.
Yes.
It's like, no, turns out I didn't really care about freedom that much anyway. Yeah, I'll accept the totalitarian state's view of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. And just, okay, if you're judging it just by, you like the results the way it came about? Yeah. But then most of us would say that missed something.
Yeah, something has been lost, right? Like what? Like agency? Sure. Sure.
And maybe those, I don't know how much subjective values leaves out sort of the program who thinks that, because I take it that they should want to parse that or distinguish it between sort of general moral principles.
Yes. Yeah.
Personal. Like,
So,
I value
absolutely,
this way
yeah.
of life.
Yes. So the subjective value is really supposed to be what value you attach to certain kinds of experience. So it's really focused on like, so when I'm trying to figure out, do I want to have kids? I could have all kinds of things that have nothing to do with my experience. Like, do I think it's the right thing to do to bring a child into the world? Or is it important to someone else like my parents that they have an heir? I can think of all kinds of other things, right? That really have nothing to do with what my experience will be like. And of course I can make decisions on the basis of those things. I think what she's thinking about are cases where, for some people, what their real focus on is like, would I really like to have a child? Would that be something I would find valuable? The experience of raising a child and helping craft an individual and stuff, right? And so I think her focus is, if that's the basis, that's something she thinks is inaccessible to us, unless and until you have that experience, right? Of course, what she's not saying is that it will definitely be positive or negative, right? Because it might be the case that you think, oh yeah, I would love that, and then it turns out, do it, don't love it so much, right? So there's all sorts of possibilities. I think the most interesting thing here is just the idea that some experiences might change me in a way that is maybe not if entirely predictable, right? Has some level of opacity to it, and would require that I know some stuff that I just don't know.
Now, it strikes me that this is an interesting counterpoint. I figure in the literature,
Okay.
somebody has to apply this.
Sure.
How do they contrast this with Rawls's faith of ignorance? Because Rawls was to say, that's actually what is the rational thing. You find out what's rational by saying,
Sure.
no, don't judge based on, well, I know who I am and what I really like.
Sure.
Like,
Yeah.
Victor Wembanyama would say, if we're going to imagine a society, I'd like one where people are 7'4" and really agile, get paid lots and lots of money for bouncing a rubber ball around. That'd be a great world to be in.
Sure.
But wait.
And it is
Rawls
for
says,
Victor
"You don't
Wembanyama.
know that you're that tall in this
That's true.
scenario.
Yeah.
You don't know
Sure.
you're good at
Yeah.
basketball, so
Yes.
you can't go that route."
Yeah.
See, here
So-
she's saying you have to do it based on what you can think of as your subjective ones, and you don't
Yeah.
have to guess.
Well, I think-
the veil of ignorance about your own
What-
subjective value.
You are sort of, that's right. Yeah, you are kind of behind a veil of ignorance about your values. I mean, I think, again, she thinks that you can make the decision on other factors entirely,
Yes.
right? But if what you're trying to do is figure out, would I like it and value it for me, then that's going to be different than, do I think it's the right thing to do, or the socially productive thing to do, or other kinds of things.
Whether it's a just
Sure.
just
Absolutely.
policy.
Yeah. Yeah. The other thing I guess I think about here, I mean, certainly, I'm talking about this, but I'm certainly not an expert on all of this stuff. I've read everything that's been published on this stuff. I have not seen anything that makes a comparison to Rawls and the veil of ignorance in this. Paul is pretty widely read, so she often is citing stuff that like I didn't know about from the 70s or whatever, but I didn't notice anything related to that. Although I'm sure that there's some pretty obvious parallel there.
Might be
I think that-
for distinguisher.
Sure.
See, Rawls is doing it generally. She's saying, no, what I want you to know is whether you
Yes.
personally, and
Yeah.
Rawls is trying to factor that
Yeah.
out specifically.
Yeah.
with his baby.
Yes.
Don't get to take into account your own subjective preferences and values.
Yeah.
The opposites.
It is. Yeah, that's right. Well,
That's
and the
connection.
absolutely, yeah. Well, and the other thing it is too, Clark was just talking about Rawls and like the veil of ignorance, Lori. So another thing that we might think about here that's just a little different is, of course, I mean, for Rawls, what you're trying to think of is like, what is the sort of best and most just kind of society? And that's right. And this person is thinking about a particular aspect. They're also, again, I mean, if there are really good, strong moral reasons to say not have a kid, then that is going to be a counterweight to, but I would really like it, or something like that, right? The other thing I think she's trying to, I mean, I think what she's trying to appeal to is what she takes to be, and of course, maybe this is not true, what she takes to be a pretty common method of kind of reasoning, right? Where I look forward and I say, do I want to do this? Well, let me list all the pros and cons, but then also like, what particularly would I like? Would I really like to move to the city? Would I like to become a lawyer, or whatever it is that would change me? And then I kind of project myself forward and my preferences for it on that basis. So of course we make decisions based on other considerations as well, that aren't just exhausted by what I would like or what I would personally value. I think that's absolutely right.
No, yeah,
So-
and that she's exactly right. So much of what we do is you consult your own personal preferences. A
Mhm.
lot of our decisions are based on
Yeah.
subjective preferences.
Well, especially about our life and the path of our life.
grew up in a small town or on a farm as I did.
Yeah.
Okay, I like that.
Yeah.
Okay, now you're gonna go to Brooklyn, New York. Well, gee, I won't like that.
Yeah, yeah.
But then maybe the transformative experience is like, oh, you go there.
Yeah.
This is wonderful. I love getting on the subway. Would never have imagined.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great example, right? I mean, I think that so I think about this. I grew up in Larned, Kansas, which is like a town about 5,000 people. Yep. Yep. My dad was a
Big town.
Did you go to Pawnee Rock? Okay, yeah. Yeah. So you were in an even smaller town.
You got it.
Pawnee Rock's even smaller than
I
one.
was in. I was on a farm.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, yeah. So I grew up out in the country. We didn't farm. My dad was just anti-authority, so that was the reason to be out in the country. So I grew up out in the country, about 12 miles outside of Larned, and we went in. Larned was the town.
Yeah.
So a lot of my childhood was spent with me and my sister and my father and no one else, because your nearest neighbor is half a mile away. You're not hanging out with anybody. Yeah. So that's a very different experience. And then and this is going to sound very funny to many of you because you have different experiences than me. But so when I came to Hayes for my college, because I got a scholarship and I got Pell Grants and it was inexpensive and stuff. And I wanted to be near my future ex-wife because I didn't know she was going to be my future ex-wife. Right? So I had to be pretty close for that reason.
Yeah.
There is, for sure. So I did that. But I tell you, when I moved to Hayes and I first tried to sleep, it was weird because it was noisy in one way and also not in another way, right? There weren't crickets and there weren't things howling, but there was like music and sirens. And I was like, who can sleep with all this racket and not the things, right? But to me, and again, this is very silly, to me, Hayes was like, oh, the big city. It's a big town, right? It's 20,000 people. It's tiny, right? So then when I went to grad school in Norman, Oklahoma, and that's about 130,000 people, which is still much bigger than here, but compared to New York or Houston, it's nothing, right? So I came there and I was just like, oh my God, everything's so massive. There's so much traffic and congestion. There's so many people. And I had two friends in grad school. One was from Houston and one had grown up in Manhattan. And they were like, this is like a country bumpkin rural. Like, what is this, right? And so for me, my experience of that was quite different than theirs on the basis of those prior experiences and what they were familiar with, right? And you know, I do think that for some people, they might think would not like a big town, and then they go there and they do, right? Because they just don't really have a good way to predict it if they've never done it before. So
For me, the transformative
yes.
experience was living abroad.
Oh yeah. Oh, that's perfect.
So I was in Belgium for a year.
Okay.
Zaire for 2 years.
Wow. Okay.
Just to constantly be exposed to what other people think of the US.
Yeah.
Think of Americans.
Yeah.
Just change. Just change.
Learned to tell me from Canada. Right?
Yeah. Right. One of the things that people are talking about now, Lori, is how living internationally could be transformative and stuff. So, where was that at? I'm sorry. Oh, okay.
So I went there on a summer program for a month. I loved it. Went back for a year for an exchange year. Really loved it. Fell in love with a future ex, not husband, thank God. And then moved back in part for him, but also because I really wanted to start my life there.
Yeah.
In 2019. Now there were a lot of things I didn't see happening. One was what would happen about a year after I moved.
Yeah. The COVID pandemic. Yeah, for sure.
Or that I wouldn't have a roommate and spend that I would write my final German language certification exam the weekend the world shut down.
Yeah.
And then spend essentially a year and a half alone in my apartment.
Yeah. Yeah.
I was there.
Yeah.
I moved there in March of 2019 and I came back to Hayes in October of 22.
Yeah.
So
that would have been for you a good example of like a transformative experience where you learn some new stuff, right? Presumably in addition to how people viewed Americans in the US, just like what a totally different form of life might be. And
well, and it was also a big city too. I grew up in Hayes. I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska,
okay.
But I lived in Hayes since I was 6.
Okay.
And so I was very used to Hayes. I was very used to, just sort of the standard way of life here. If you're
Sure.
from rural America, you kind of get the sense that there's only one way to do life.
Sure. Yep.
being abroad showed me that does not necessarily.
Yeah, yeah.
So.
So that was an adjustment, probably a significant adjustment. Yeah.
I did love living in a big city or living in a big city with adequate public transportation, so I did not have to.
Yeah, yeah.
I would love to live in a bigger city in the States, but that's one major issue giving me pause.
Sure. Yeah. That is true. It's quite expensive. Yeah.
It's actually a liability to have.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a good example. Yeah. Living internationally. Yeah, go ahead.
Being away from everything I had ever known.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Developed, like you were talking about religious experiences too. I also
Sure.
had a bit of a, there was, I
Yeah.
was raised conservative Christian. I did Christian college for a couple of years.
Uh-huh.
I was very committed to my faith.
Yeah.
And I was confronted with a bunch of things that made me question pretty much all
Sure.
of it. I can't really say what I am.
Sure. Yeah.
But
So you had a conversion experience, maybe in a different way, in an opposite way or something. Yeah. Sure.
deconstruction.
Sure. Sure. No, I think those are great examples of this exact topic.
Learning another language play into this.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Like because I'm functionally fluent in German. So there's 6 levels of language you can achieve.
Okay.
A1 is like super basic, like we can drive into the country and you can feed yourself. No, most people and then
They're speaking German to each other.
and then there's C2, which is like next to mother language.
Okay.
I have a C1. It's 4 years old.
Okay.
But, and like I said, I took this certification exam for that, and then sat alone for about a year and a half, mostly speaking English with my friends.
Oh, yeah.
Like.
Oh, okay.
University subjects.
Oh, okay.
I've been seriously studying for 5 years.
I see. Okay.
What was considered here a pretty good student to have them get best if I worked really, really.
Okay. Yeah.
I mean,
Jarring. Yeah.
yeah, I don't know how much formative experience that was, but it was definitely a huge.
Sure. Yeah.
But I think I can predict I wouldn't like.
Yeah.
There's one to your ego, when you think
Sure.
something's pretty good, and then all of a sudden you find out.
Yeah.
I would think so. I would think that could be significant. Yeah.
I didn't consider it at all until I realized I hated my major. And that
Uh-huh.
was also the autonomy thing.
Okay.
I realized I don't enjoy justifying my existence to the government every couple of years.
Okay. Sure. Yeah.
Blessing to change some of those decisions.
Sure.
Like
Yeah.
changing my major.
Yes.
I say I
As an expat in Germany in
Exactly.
particular.
and
Yeah.
like say I said, okay, screw this, I'm just gonna find a job. I would have needed a special appointment for that as well. And
Yeah.
you can just forget anything you've ever heard about German efficiency, replace it with bureaucracy, and multiply it by a factor.
Yeah.
My daughter is living in Germany.
Is he military?
No. He went over to exchange student and never came.
That was what I wanted. That was what I wanted to do, and I've been kicking around in the back of my mind, like, would I want to go back? And part
Sure.
of me really wants to,
Yeah.
and part of me isn't.
Sure.
Because
Yeah.
there were a lot of other personal issues going on at the time, like the pandemic, which meant I had to study online, which meant I wasn't making the connections.
Of course. Yeah.
Well, those classes.
Yeah.
The reason I passed medieval German was because someone I'd taken my final German certification
Uh-huh.
class in our huge uni, in our huge major, by the grace of whatever you believe in,
Yeah.
ended up in the same class as me.
Yeah.
So she was able to
Yeah.
and I realized I'm much more of a social person. I
Sure.
always classified myself as an introvert, and then being forced to spend way more time alone. than I
Sure.
expected I would in my life.
You were like, oh, I actually do like other people. Yeah.
Actually need to talk to people at least every couple of days, otherwise I start getting really weird.
Sure. Sure. Yeah. Yeah.
personal relationship.
Sure.
Like with the,
Future X.
yeah,
Yep.
future ex.
Yeah.
Then one of my other really close personal relationships at that time basically imploded shortly before I
Sure.
moved back.
Yeah.
And that was hard because
Yeah.
it was part of my support system more or less from the beginning.
Yeah. I think those are very good examples of those kind of transformative things. But certainly losing a person that you love can have a radical shift on your life for sure.
Experience too, because
Yeah.
like he's still alive. Like we're
Yeah.
still in the same friend group, but we're no longer friends.
Yeah. So that is particularly weird and difficult. Sure. Sure. Yeah. What are you thinking about, David? You've raised your finger a couple times.
Some of the things you mentioned, of a conversion experience.
Sure.
And that's certainly a good example. But I was thinking about like getting her idea of rationally wanting something that would be so transformative. What if I want to attain enlightenment?
Yeah.
I want nirvana.
Yeah.
I want to go to heaven when I die.
Yeah.
Can I rationally want it? It seems like we could. It seems like they try to sell you on this.
They do try to sell you on this. Yeah, that's right.
You want to become something that's utterly different than you are now.
Yeah. Yeah. This is a great example. So Lori, and for the recording, David just gave the example of could I want to say go to heaven and be radically transformed, or could I want to achieve enlightenment and would also require significant change and transformation from who I am now? I think that's a great question. I think that certainly, as David said, they try to sell you on it. And certainly people try to explain to you, this is why it would be so amazing to do this and why it would be so valuable and stuff. I mean, I think that, this kind of reminds me of the, old Bernard Williams paper on immortality, that a person couldn't rationally desire it. And the reason is you would either, as the person you are, get bored or become a different person. And thus you can't desire it for yourself. You can desire it for someone else, but that's what essentially you're doing if you want to do it. There's a really funny paper by, I can't think of the guy's name, Brian Ribera, I think. He taught, and maybe he still does, I don't know, I've lost touch with him, at UT Knoxville, University of Tennessee, Knoxville. And he wrote this really funny paper called The Problem of Heaven. And basically it's him describing why he thinks he would not want to go to heaven. And it has to do with some of the things that we're thinking about here of like, I would become a radically different person. I would be vastly different. Also, I'm not sure that any activity is infinitely enjoyable, such that if I'm there eternally, I would get bored eventually with everything or something. Again, similar stuff to how Williams talks about it. The fun part of that is he spends some time in the first part of the paper surveying a bunch of country music songs where people say things like, if there ain't no cowboys in heaven, I don't want to go. Or there's a song by, I can't think of who it's by, in the song, the main protagonist is talking to these like hobos that are around like a fire. And they basically say, if there's no Mogan David in heaven, I don't want to go, or something like that, right? In heaven, there's no, sure, yeah. So I do think thinking about this is interesting from the perspective of just like, what would that even be like? And could we really want it? But really thinking about this transformative stuff, I mean, presumably it would require a significant change. And certainly people who, I mean, you think about like the Buddha left his wife and child behind because he had to go do this thing. And that's a pretty, I would think, significant change in values of what is important and how you should, focus your life. But you got to, right? So, uh-huh.
Well, why would I want nirvana?
Yeah.
The answer is always negative because you don't like suffering, do you? No, I guess not.
Yeah.
What positive then is just, well, he was real cagey about it. And I think
Yes.
he's very reasons.
Yes. Yeah. Because it's maybe inaccessible and there isn't a lot to say about it. Yeah. It turns out when you can just say it's the negative predication is maybe easier, right? It's not this, doesn't involve suffering. Okay, well, I guess I'm more into that than something that would involve a lot of suffering, I suppose. So Lori, do you have any thoughts on this? And I'll repeat your question or your comment to the group too, if you.
I don't really. It's just an interesting timing for me, only because I'm considering making a drastic change in my life by moving from Rhode Island to a place like Kentucky. So this is an interesting topic for me at the moment.
Yeah.
But
Well,
that's-
I'll make sure that when we have the recording, I'll see if we can't get like some links to some papers or books or things so that if you're interested, you can look at it.
I wrote
further.
some stuff down too.
Oh, okay, great. Yeah. So what Lori said to everybody, if you couldn't hear her, is she thinks it's a really interesting topic because she's currently considering a dramatic change from moving from Rhode Island to Kentucky, which would be quite different. Yeah. So one of the people just said, "Oh God." So I don't know if that's from personal experience or not, but it is. She's nodding. Yeah. Huh?
H.G. Wells, the time machine.
Okay. Another person wants to know if you've seen H.G. Wells' The Time Machine, because that's where you're going, apparently. So yeah, gonna hang out with Morlocks. Yeah, it depends on what part of Kentucky. No, I think that is interesting, Lori, and I do think that's a good example. I mean, if you're contemplating a massive career change, that's a similar kind of thing, right? Which I may be, or we may be eventually if they shut our major down.
How
So.
early do we make our students find a major?
Yeah, no, that's a good point too. Yeah, yeah. So David just mentioned, how early do we make students declare majors? Because it is really too early is the exact right answer. Yeah, because I mean, I don't know. I don't really know. I'm not sure that I really know what I wanted when I was 18 or 19. Certainly not enough to project this is what I'm going to want to do in 30 years or whatever. But I mean, I lucked out. It turns out it worked out for me pretty well, but.
I studied English
Mhm.
now with my life experience. Like, pardon me, wonders if maybe I would be better suited for sociology or something.
Oh, sure.
But I would have known that 10 years ago.
Yes.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. So I think that's a really good point. Although it maybe edges us closer to Clark's earlier worry about if this applies too broadly and then everybody has a bunch of it at different times or whatever. No, I think that's a good example. Yeah.
That's both comforting and terrifying.
They're talking about sort of, because you mentioned.
Uh-huh,
the
yeah.
interesting point that
Sure.
It's not rational to want it, it's also rational not to. Okay?
Yeah.
About having a situation in which you had something you really wanted, not getting it.
Yeah.
Was the sort of transformation.
Sure.
You realize how lucky you were, say, not to have gotten the thing you wanted so much.
Oh,
badly.
sure. Oh, that's interesting.
Yep, that's good.
Yeah. So Clark, that's really good. Yeah. So what Clark just said was, what about cases where, you really wanted something and you didn't get it? And so just make sure I'm understanding the case right.
Thank God.
You really didn't like it initially, but later you were very grateful that you didn't. Is that right? Or yeah.
Wanting
So-
to get a promotion position.
Yeah.
Not getting it being the best thing that could happen.
That could have happened to you for sure. Yeah.
Stayed in the career path that would have been stultifying.
Absolutely.
And then it'd been too late.
Yeah. Oh, thank you so much. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that so what she ultimately thinks you should do in some of these cases is you basically, I mean, in her view, the practical advice is maybe in some of those cases, what we really have to do is just approach them with a lot of epistemic humility and basically try to do our best, but recognize we might really be totally wrong about what we really want and what we will value in 5 years. And the best we can do, I mean, on her view in this way is to say, am I open to what could be a significant change in myself or not? Because that might be as broad as you want to get if you don't really know what the specific contents are going to be like. And in certain cases, I think we want to do that, right? Like, I don't think we would, well, I think for a lot of people, you wouldn't want to say, I am so fearful of any change to my values or my, epistemic experiences that I'm just never going to move out of my town, I'm never going to go to college, I'm never going to meet someone who is different than me or whatever. But it's also probably the case that, like, for some people, it's going to be really reasonable to go, yeah, do I want to move to Italy and up in my whole life? I don't think I do right now or at this point or whatever it is, right? Because of course we always are making decisions in a time indexed way for at the moment that we're at, and projecting and guessing and hoping what the future is going to be like. And so I think part of it is just, how open are you, and how much is it driven by what you take to be your values, and not, again, part of what she doesn't want to happen is people to just externally tell you, well, everybody thinks this is good, so you should do it. Maybe it is, but also maybe their experiences have changed them in such a way that it's a little different or something.
So,
Yes.
what is the difference between transformation
Uh-huh.
and evolution? Because in my own thinking,
Sure.
there was a transformative event in that in an instant I became a widow from a wife,
Yeah,
which was a real transformation.
absolutely.
The person that I have evolved to in the last 8.5 years has been very subtle and not,
Yeah, that's good.
it's just been little things
Yeah.
building upon each other. So it wasn't, that was a major transformation.
Absolutely. Yeah.
But I don't know that that moment, it changed me to be the person I
Sure.
am now.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's really good.
I think some people expect it to be an instantaneous transformation. And
Right.
they're kind of disappointed when it isn't. I
Yeah.
thought, I was going to have this baby and everything would be different, like
Yeah.
my friend said it was.
Yeah.
Not knowing that might happen slowly.
It might take time.
Right.
Yeah.
Over a long period of time.
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Tradition.
Well,
Is that all there is?
Absolutely. Yeah.
And the two, maybe you don't want to.
You're right. Yeah.
No, from too long, I was fine. No, two. When you could walk and talk and make his wishes known, we were good.
Easy after that.
Yeah, before that, he was a parasite, and I tell people.
So, Lori, the question or suggestion was, how might we differentiate transformation from evolution? So the example is, I'm so sorry. What is your name?
Diana.
Diana. I know that. I've heard your name so many times. I'm so sorry. I just keep forgetting it. I've
It's
talked to
not
you
a
so
problem.
many times. So Diana suggested, an example would be, in a very quick moment, she went from being a wife to a widow, but that the change in her person and those values and stuff was a slower, more subtle, kind of lengthier thing over a long period of time. I guess I think I think that would still count as a transformation,
Mhm.
because I think that even if the change isn't instantaneous, a lot of those events are things that occur over time. Child rearing, as Clark said, is a good example of this. Even when people think they expect it to be instantaneous, and it's not. But really,
It is one aspect of it,
sure,
but it does take time.
takes some time. Yeah. It's interesting. We were talking about personal identity earlier, and I think the way that we think of this, like the common kind of Western positions would be something like, you are your body, you're an organism, and that's what makes you the same through time, or you have a certain kind of psychological continuity, you're a mental kind of thing, and that's what makes you the same through time. On a Confucian view, the idea is supposed to be that your personal identity is comprised by the roles and relationships that you enter into. And so on a Confucian view, they would say, for example, the moment that you became a widow, you are not the same numerically, you're not the same person, because they take those roles and relationships to be constitutive of who you are, which really ends up resulting in, you don't really have a lot of stable diachronic personal identity, because those things change so much, right? But in a different way than like Hume or the Buddha or people might have given that account. So
Got to thinking about the childbirth, et cetera.
Yes.
Didn't change you much, but as
Yeah.
we're talking now, I went home. There's so much of group of people and their
Mhm.
kids and somebody else's mom or dad.
okay.
Everyone turns to. That's their new goal.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah, see, that is a transformation. You
Sure.
have person identity, normal, and all that.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. And people talk about this, right? Of like feeling like they are not an individual separate from their parental role or something like that.
But
Yeah.
it's somebody else's mom and all the women sure.
Yeah. What are you thinking about, Alan? I thought your hand was up. Were you just like rubbing something? Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah, this is not a good time. Okay. Yeah, sure.
The one was like, okay, think about the individual in Avatar. See, for me, that was in fact.
In Avatar.
Yeah, I saw that when I was on Staten Island.
Okay.
The one saying the plot, there's no there. But anyway,
So I'll just give you a quick side note. Years ago, my wife and I, my now wife, not future ex, current and permanent, current and permanent, wonderful person. We went to visit the first time I'd ever been to New York City. We went because my friend was getting married there. And so we're just like, well, that's a good reason to go as any. We made the mistake of staying in an Airbnb on Staten Island. And the events were constantly in Manhattan, which means we were on that ferry and on those buses constantly. So I'm so sorry. So you were in Staten Island and you saw Avatar. Okay.
that's about an individual who was normally a confident person in his normal, but then he's placed inside this, he gets to be as if
A
he's
Navi or whatever.
right,
Mhm.
and is inept.
Yeah.
Is the classic fish out of the water. In fact, the other person that other Navi is like, yeah, it seems to me as a child, you're so,
Yeah.
feeble or whatever.
Yes.
You can't take care of yourself, whatever.
Yeah.
How do you ever survive? It's really kind of denigrating an individual. And that was probably for that person almost a transformation, transformative.
Oh, yeah.
The one I thought was kind of realistic was
Uh-huh.
Rumspringa.
Oh, Rumspringa. Oh, that's phenomenal. Yeah.
Think about what that's like. And
That's a great example.
So that you can go through that experience, and they don't know whether they're going to come back. And the ones, whether they do or not, it was probably transformative.
Oh my God. Yeah, I would
Especially the ones
imagine.
who don't go.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's a great example. She gives Rumspringa. Yeah. Explain this.
Well, I
Clark.
even looked this up to see. Yeah.
Lori, you know what Rumspringa is?
Normally, it begins at 8.
Oh, okay. You can't hear. Okay, you can hear. Never mind.
Amish community will have their youth.
Oh, yeah.
been
Go
raised
experiment.
us,
Yeah,
go to
I
the,
got it.
go
I
to the
got it.
big city
I
and
got it.
go see how sinful it is.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I should know that.
Yes.
Cause you never went back.
Yeah.
Is that just for them?
So yeah, so that's a good example. She gives another example of like, say someone that
It's good.
is congenitally blind, but could have like a retinal surgery, that would be kind of transformative experience for them.
Yeah.
And Carol and Kid, who are those are the people that expand it and really focus less on like agency and do I want to undergo something, but more just like stuff happens to us. A lot of their focus is on like, losing a loved one, grief, or like, being struck with a serious medical issue out of nowhere or something like that, right? That those two can be kind of transformative experiences for us.
Are transformative events
Yeah.
the same for a voluntary versus an involuntary transformation? Do you think you go through the same type?
Oh, I mean, I guess I think the only thing that is probably similar there is that there's a change, right? Because I think that
By the definition of the word.
by the definition of transformation, it would be the same, but like, I don't think I would think the mechanism would probably be quite different. It's also probably has a different kind of phenomenological feel. I mean, no matter whether I end up liking something or not, if I chose it, it has a certain feel of my expression of my autonomy. Whereas when something happens to you externally that you didn't get to choose, that's very different, right? Those things, of course, can still end up being positive, right? But they also, I think probably have more of a tendency to at least a certain kind of negative negation or something, right? I mean, when you, well, yeah, I mean, as Clark said earlier, and as several people have attested to, all of us, I'm sure, have lost someone that we love, whether permanently or sometimes they're still there and that's harder, right? But I mean, if you think about what that's like, I mean, a lot of things are different, right? I mean, there's this practical identity stuff of like how people perceive you in a social web and how you even understand yourself in that kind of social context. There's maybe even some stuff about the background of your experience. You kind of, have taken it for granted for a long time. This person's going to be around, and your immediate reaction mentally or whatever is probably it's still there. And then you got to go, oh no, it doesn't work that way or whatever, right? And that involves a number of things, right? If you think of grief as like a kind of process or experience that has extended duration as opposed to just an emotion or something, then that makes even more sense to think about grief as an example of this kind of thing where things are very different, in a real transformed way. But sometimes, you come out of that and you think, Yeah, you know, even if it was very difficult and painful, I don't know, it led me to this point and I like where I'm at now or something. And so, you know,
Which is really hard to reconcile
yes.
with that.
Yeah. With the negative, that
Yeah.
horrific,
I
awful
should
part of it.
not feel
That this way.
enjoy where I'm at now because that was such a horrific event.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, it's really difficult. to
It is.
reconcile.
That's a really good point. Yeah. Yeah.
I always come back to 9/11.
Okay.
Okay, so I think 9/12, I had to take a part in the Wichita,
Uh-huh.
no traffic. Have you ever been in Wichita? No traffic.
Yeah.
So I'm going, there were people in the school I was teaching, I was at, who had, Jerry Major's wife, son. Had a new job at the World Trade Center that very day,
Oh, wow.
but he didn't have to show up to work till noon.
Oh,
So the difference in our experiences was like
sure.
miles apart.
Yeah.
And then I'm going, you know, I thought, boy, I'm weird. I'm going on with my regular life and the rest of the world is not. Even, you know,
Sure.
in little Woodbine, Kansas, 200 people.
Yeah. Smaller than Larned.
So, you know, I feel like not affected at all.
Sure. Right.
Other than this is horrific.
Yeah.
And other people are just like.
Maybe you're more affected the first time you fly or
Yeah,
something,
the
but
devastation. So, you know, the same event affects people in the same birth area,
Yeah.
so much different.
yeah.
And I just got, wow, you know. So some people are transformed.
Yeah. Sure.
Whoops, I'm a little weird. You know,
Do you think you could want to be a shark, David? Because I think it's a really interesting question. Because I often think about this. Like I thought about this a lot when I was younger. You know, we being out on the not that particular thing. I didn't think, man, what it'd be like if I was a shark a lot when I was younger. But we, you know, being out in the country, we had lots of animals, and we had, you know, there were definitely a lot of outdoor animals, but there were some indoor animals. Like we had a couple indoor cats, and I just thought, man, those cats are living the life, boy. They just nap whenever they want to, and they just complain and get treats, and they're protected from all of their natural predators, and they can just terrorize anything in the house at 3 a.m. That doesn't matter. All we're gonna do is go, dang it, cat, stop it, and then it will suffer no consequences, right? So part of me have always thought like, I don't know, that sounds pretty sweet. That sounds pretty good. And of course it makes me think about the you know, the example from John Stuart Mill of, you know, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, or a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied, Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. But certainly I would be a liar if I said it never cropped up. Like, I don't know, that's life. No bills. I don't gotta worry about securing food. I have no responsibilities. I can nap whenever I want, which is awesome.
I have occasionally told my cat that it's hard to do.
Oh, I gotta go on the time.
Do you ever pick a spirit animal? You know?
A biggest spirit animal. That's right. Yeah. I don't know. It's interesting.
I had a business partner that was spirit animal was a pelican.
Oh, okay.
Because he liked to fly and he liked seafood.
Okay. That's pretty good. That's pretty good. Yeah. Well, is there any other element of this that any of you are interested in talking about or asking about, or?
I just the question as a follow.
Yeah.
And then not having read her word.
Yes.
I mean, it does seem like the immediate logical implication that is that you couldn't want the kind of spiritual transformation of like, you know, the active vision of God or something.
Yeah.
It's like Kirby just immediately implies that you couldn't or not want it.
Sure. Yeah. I think that, I mean, look, I think what you're saying is right. I have not read anything specifically on that from people that have talked about it, but I mean, that is a pretty obvious connection there, right? Because if it's going to be true, if this is going to be true about something like childbirth or religious conversion, of course it will be true, maybe magnitudes more for something that is even more radical like that. I mean, I think part of it is going to come down to two questions, which we might think about. One of them is kind of was what I was thinking about as like Clark's question, which is, to what extent does this change really result in you being a different person, right? Because I mean, arguably something like being in the presence of God in the beatific vision and having every vice and sin and negativity purged from you, which is usually part of the requirement because you're in the presence of God. There can be evil in the presence of God or whatever. That would mean that is a radically different you. And is it still even you? The other question I think is going to be, what she says about all these other things, which is to what extent are you open and receptive to basically becoming very different? And that again is probably different for person to person. So insofar as you're open to, she talks about this as experiencing a revelation in your life when you undergo these transformative experiences. If you're open to that kind of even higher order religious, I guess, revelation, maybe that's the thing that is going to guide you. But yeah, strictly speaking, if I'm just imagining what it's supposed to be like for me, she would say that's also not suitable. You can't rationally desire it or rationally think it wouldn't be good for me or something because of that, again, opacity or inaccessibility of the experience after you're changed. So. All right. Well, thank you, everybody. Thank you very much, Lori, for attending online.
Thank you for making me or allowing me to do it. Thank you.
Of course. Absolutely. Yeah. And all of those that are watching the recording, I hope you enjoyed it. Have a great day. And